The screaming started at exactly 7:32 in the morning. I know because I was watching from my kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, as Karen Blackwell and 5 other HOA board members thrashed in the murky water of my grandfather's pond. What had been meant as their victory lap, their final humiliation of the stubborn ranch owner who refused to bow to their suburban empire, had turned into something far more primal and terrifying. The massive shapes moving beneath the surface were not logs or debris. They were the ancient guardians my grandfather had protected for decades, and they did not appreciate uninvited guests disturbing their territory. Karen's perfectly styled hair was now plastered to her head as she clung to a half-submerged branch, her designer hunting outfit torn and muddy, her voice cracking as she screamed for help. 6 months ago, she had stood in my living room and declared that my family's ranch would be transformed into a proper suburban development whether I liked it or not. Now, she was learning that some forces cannot be controlled by HOA bylaws and legal threats. As I reached for my phone to call for help, one thought echoed in my mind with dark satisfaction. Sometimes nature has its own way of delivering justice. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. Grandfather had passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind 50 acres of Texas ranch land that had been in our family for 3 generations. I drove the 2 hours from Austin with tears in my eyes and a heart full of memories of childhood summers spent riding horses and fishing in the 3 natural ponds that dotted his property. The ranch stretched across rolling hills covered in mesquite and oak trees, with weathered barns and corrals that told the story of decades of hard work and careful stewardship. Grandfather had always said the land chose its people, not the other way around. As I walked the familiar dirt paths and breathed in the scent of wildflowers and prairie grass, I felt the truth of those words settling deep in my bones. The house sat on a small rise overlooking the largest pond, its wraparound porch and tin roof unchanged since my childhood. Inside, everything remained exactly as grandfather had left it. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen table next to a stack of veterinary journals and handwritten notes about cattle rotations and pasture management. Photographs covered every surface, documenting 3 generations of family gatherings, livestock shows, and quiet moments of ranch life. I spent the first week handling funeral arrangements and meeting with lawyers about the inheritance. That was when I discovered the unwelcome surprise that would change everything. During the past year, the expanding suburbs had reached far enough to include grandfather's property in a new homeowners association district. What had once been unincorporated rural land was now subject to the Willowbrook Estates HOA and their extensive list of covenants and restrictions. The first meeting with the HOA board took place in a sterile conference room at their community center, surrounded by motivational posters about property values and community standards. Karen Blackwell, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table in a crisp business suit, her blonde hair styled to perfection and her smile cold as winter frost. She spoke in measured tones about bringing the ranch into compliance with community standards. The old barn would need to be demolished or completely renovated to match approved architectural guidelines. The livestock areas would have to be relocated away from neighboring properties. The ponds would require professional landscaping to meet recreational water feature specifications. I sat in stunned silence as she outlined their vision for transforming my family's ranch into something that would fit their suburban aesthetic. When I finally found my voice, it came out rougher than I intended. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother was born in that house. My grandfather spent 60 years building something meaningful here. Karen's smile never wavered as she slid a thick folder across the table. I understand this is an adjustment, but progress requires change. These covenants exist to protect everyone's property values and ensure our community maintains its standards. I flipped through pages of regulations that treated my grandfather's life work like a zoning violation. Restrictions on fence materials, livestock numbers, vegetation management, and water feature maintenance filled dozens of pages with bureaucratic language that reduced a lifetime of careful land stewardship to a series of infractions waiting to happen. What if I refuse? I asked, already knowing the answer. Karen's expression hardened slightly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the steel underneath. Then, we will pursue all available legal remedies to ensure compliance. The community association has a responsibility to all property owners to maintain standards. I drove home that evening with a growing sense of dread settling in my stomach. The ranch looked different now, viewed through the lens of their regulations. Every weathered board on the barn, every patch of native vegetation, every traditional element that made this place special was now seen as a problem to be solved. That night, I sat on the porch where grandfather had spent countless evenings watching the sunset over his land. The ponds reflected the last light of day, their surfaces occasionally disturbed by the movement of wildlife that had thrived here for decades under his protection. I could almost hear his voice on the evening breeze, reminding me that some things are worth fighting for. I had inherited more than land and buildings. I had inherited a legacy of independence and stewardship that stretched back generations. Karen Blackwell and her HOA board had no idea what they were up against, but they were about to learn that some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost. The violation notices started arriving the very next week, as if Karen had been waiting for the funeral flowers to wilt before launching her assault. The first envelope appeared in my mailbox on a Monday morning, official letterhead stark against the natural beauty surrounding my mailbox post. Violation notice. Unapproved fence materials detected on property boundaries. Barbed wire fencing does not meet community aesthetic standards. Correction required within 30 days or fines will be assessed. I stared at the notice in disbelief. The barbed wire fence had been installed by my great-grandfather in the 1940s and maintained by 3 generations of my family. It was functional, well-maintained, and appropriate for ranch land. But according to the HOA, it violated their approved materials list that favored decorative wooden or vinyl alternatives suitable for suburban lawns. The notices multiplied like weeds after a spring rain. Excessive vegetation in the south pasture, non-compliant water features lacking proper landscaping, unapproved outbuildings that detracted from community aesthetics, storage of agricultural equipment in visible locations. Each violation carried escalating fines that quickly totaled into the thousands of dollars. Karen began making personal visits to my property, arriving in her pristine white SUV like a general surveying a battlefield. She would park near the house and walk my land with a clipboard and camera, documenting every element that failed to meet her suburban vision. Her high heels left perfect holes in the soft earth as she navigated terrain that had never been designed for city shoes. I watched from the kitchen window as she photographed the chicken coop, the old windmill, and the cattle guard at the main gate. Every image would become evidence in her campaign to force compliance or drive me away entirely. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a bureaucratic battle, her perfectly applied makeup and coordinated outfit a stark contrast to the authentic, lived-in character of the ranch. The fines escalated according to a schedule that seemed designed to create maximum financial pressure. What started as $50 penalties for minor infractions quickly jumped to hundreds, and then thousands of dollars for continued noncompliance. Late fees and administrative costs multiplied the totals beyond anything reasonable for property maintenance issues. I discovered that Karen had been researching comparable property values in the area, obtaining detailed market analyses that showed the potential value of my 50 acres if developed for residential use. The numbers were staggering. My grandfather's ranch, if subdivided and developed, could generate millions of dollars in suburban housing. The harassment campaign expanded beyond official notices when Karen recruited neighbors who supported the HOA's mission. Suddenly, every visitor to my property was reported as a potential commercial activity requiring permits. Every repair project was scrutinized for compliance with building codes that had never applied to ranch operations. Every livestock movement was documented as a possible noise violation. The situation reached a breaking point during my nephew's graduation party in late April. I had invited extended family for a barbecue celebration on the ranch, continuing a tradition my grandfather had maintained for decades. The gathering was peaceful, consisting mainly of relatives sharing stories and children playing in the pastures under careful supervision. Karen arrived during the party with two other HOA board members, claiming they needed to document unauthorized commercial activity on residential property. She walked through my family gathering with her clipboard and camera, treating our celebration like a zoning violation in progress. My uncle stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Lady, this is a private family gathering on private property. You have no business being here." Karen's smile remained fixed as she continued taking photos. The HOA has a responsibility to investigate reported violations of community standards. Large gatherings require permits and compliance with noise ordinances. I felt something snap inside me as I watched this stranger treat my family like criminals for sharing a meal on our own land. The photos she was taking included my elderly aunt, my young nieces and nephews, and family members who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor my nephew's achievement. "You need to leave," I said, my voice carrying a warning that made several family members turn to look. Karen finally looked directly at me, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to open challenge. "We will leave when our investigation is complete. The community association has legal authority to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations." That night, after the family had gone home and the ranch was quiet again, I sat in my grandfather's study surrounded by his books and papers. The weight of 3 generations of family history pressed down on me as I realized the true scope of what I was facing. This was not about compliance or community standards. This was about power, money, and the systematic destruction of everything my family had built. But Karen Blackwell had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that harassment and legal pressure would be enough to break my resolve. She had no idea that my grandfather had left me more than just land and buildings. He had left me the knowledge and tools I would need to fight back, hidden in plain sight among his carefully preserved records. The real battle was just beginning. 3 weeks into May, with violation notices piling up like autumn leaves and legal threats arriving daily, I found myself sitting in my grandfather's study at 2 in the morning. Sleep had become elusive as the weight of the HOA's demands pressed down on me like a physical force. I had spent hours going through property documents, searching for some legal precedent or loophole that might protect the ranch from Karen's relentless campaign. That was when I discovered the journals. Hidden behind a row of veterinary textbooks on the bottom shelf, I found a collection of leather-bound notebooks filled with my grandfather's careful handwriting. Decades of observations about the land, the weather patterns, the wildlife, and the delicate ecosystem he had spent his life protecting and nurturing. The earliest entries dated back to the 1960s, when he first acquired the property. His young man's enthusiasm leaped off the pages as he documented every species of bird, every type of native plant, every seasonal change in the landscape. But as I read deeper into the journals, one subject began to dominate his observations with increasing frequency and concern. The ponds. All three of them, but especially the largest one visible from the house, contained something that made my grandfather both proud and deeply cautious. In entry after entry, he documented the presence of alligator snapping turtles, massive prehistoric creatures that had made the ponds their home and breeding ground. His notes revealed a population of turtles that had thrived under his protection for decades. He wrote about individuals he recognized by their scars and size, some weighing over 100 pounds with jaws powerful enough to snap a broomstick in half. During mating season in late spring and early summer, they became intensely territorial, defending their nesting areas with aggressive determination that could be dangerous to anyone who disturbed their habitat. I found detailed diagrams showing the underwater root systems and fallen logs where the turtles liked to hide, waiting motionless for hours before striking at anything that entered their territory. Grandfather had marked the deep holes where they hibernated during winter and the shallow areas where they laid their eggs. Every pond had multiple residents, turning what looked like peaceful water features into complex ecosystems ruled by ancient predators. The warnings filled page after page. Never swim in the ponds during turtle season. Never wade in the muddy areas near the banks where footing was uncertain. Always assume that what looked like a log or rock might actually be a 100-pound turtle with a bite force that could remove fingers or worse. He had spent decades keeping visitors safe while allowing the turtles to thrive in their natural habitat. Most importantly, I discovered that my grandfather had been in contact with state wildlife officials for years, documenting the turtle population and ensuring that their habitat remained protected under federal environmental regulations. The ponds were not just water features or potential recreational areas. They were legally protected wildlife habitat that could not be disturbed without extensive permits and environmental impact studies. I sat back in his leather chair, the implications of this discovery washing over me like cold water. Karen and her HOA board had been planning to transform my property without any knowledge of what actually lived here. Their dreams of suburban development and recreational water features would run headlong into federal environmental protection laws that carried serious penalties for violations. But more than that, I realized that my grandfather had left me the perfect trap for my tormentors. Karen's arrogance and ignorance about the true nature of the ranch would become her downfall. She had spent weeks documenting every element of the property that failed to meet her suburban standards, but she had never bothered to learn what made this land special or why it needed protection. The ancient guardians of the ponds had been waiting patiently beneath the surface, protected by my grandfather's wisdom and now by federal law. Karen Blackwell was about to discover that some battles are fought by forces far older and more powerful than HOA bylaws and legal threats. I closed the journals and looked out the window toward the largest pond, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. Somewhere beneath that peaceful water, creatures that had survived since the age of dinosaurs were going about their ancient business of protecting their territory. Soon, they would have uninvited guests. The plan began forming in my mind as I read and reread my grandfather's journals over the following days. If Karen wanted to play games of psychological warfare and bureaucratic manipulation, I would give her exactly what she thought she wanted. But first, I needed to make her overconfident, to make her believe that victory was within her grasp. I started by deliberately neglecting certain areas of the property maintenance that had nothing to do with essential ranch operations. I let the decorative flower beds near the house grow wild with native vegetation. I allowed the gravel driveway to develop potholes and weeds along the edges. Most importantly, I stopped trimming the brush and tall grass around the pond areas, making them look abandoned and unkempt. The effect was immediate and exactly what I had hoped for. Karen's violation notices took on a tone of barely concealed triumph as she documented each new infraction. Her personal visits became more frequent and more intrusive, as if she sensed weakness and was moving in for the final assault. I played my part perfectly, appearing increasingly overwhelmed and defeated during our encounters. When she arrived for her weekly inspection tour, I would emerge from the house looking tired and stressed, my shoulders slumped in apparent resignation. I made sure she overheard phone conversations about mounting legal bills and the impossibility of bringing the property into compliance with all their regulations. "I just do not know how much more of this I can take," I said loudly into my phone one afternoon, making sure Karen could hear me from where she stood photographing the chicken coop. "The fines are adding up faster than I can pay them, and the lawyers say compliance could cost more than the property is worth." Karen's expression brightened noticeably as she pretended not to listen. She spent extra time that day photographing the pond areas, taking detailed shots of the overgrown vegetation and the weathered dock that extended into the water. I watched from the kitchen window as she walked closer to the water's edge than she had ever ventured before, her high heels sinking slightly into the soft mud at the bank. She had no idea that she was being watched from below by eyes that had seen decades pass without concern for human affairs. The large turtle my grandfather had named Old Moses was visible as a dark shadow just beneath the surface, motionless as a submerged log, but tracking every movement along his territory's boundary. The psychological campaign intensified when I began leaving property boundary markers deliberately ambiguous in the areas around the ponds. I removed several fence posts that had clearly marked the edges of my land, creating the impression that I was either too overwhelmed to maintain proper boundaries or too financially strapped to afford the repairs. Karen and her board members began discussing development possibilities with increasing boldness. I overheard conversations about the potential for recreational amenities and upscale housing that could transform the entire area. The ponds featured prominently in their discussions, with talk of swimming areas, fishing docks, and waterfront property values that could justify expensive development projects. I documented everything while maintaining my facade of defeated compliance. Every unauthorized visit to my property was recorded. Every discussion about future development plans was noted. Every violation of my property rights was carefully cataloged for future legal reference. The breakthrough came in early June when Karen made a crucial mistake. She brought a group of potential investors to survey the property without my permission, leading them on a tour that treated my family's ranch like vacant land awaiting development. They stood at the edge of the largest pond discussing dock construction and swimming area improvements, while the territorial inhabitants lurked just feet away beneath the surface. I watched from the house as Karen gestured expansively toward the water, clearly painting a picture of recreational paradise for her wealthy companions. Her confidence had reached the point of arrogance, and she was making decisions about my property as if she already owned it. That evening, I called my grandfather's old friend at the state wildlife department and informed him that unauthorized individuals had been surveying protected turtle habitat without permits. I mentioned that they seemed to be planning construction activities that would disturb the ecosystem during peak breeding season. His response was immediate and serious. Disturbing protected wildlife habitat carried federal penalties that included substantial fines and potential criminal charges. He promised to flag my property in their enforcement database and suggested I document any future unauthorized activities. The trap was set. Karen's overconfidence and ignorance about the true nature of the property had led her exactly where I needed her to go. Now, I just had to wait for her to take the final step that would bring her face to face with the ancient guardians my grandfather had protected for decades. Karen's next move was so predictable that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. During the third week of June, she arrived at my door with a folder full of documents and a smile that barely concealed her sense of impending victory. She had clearly decided that the time for subtle pressure had passed and direct demands were now appropriate. "We need to discuss community engagement activities for your property," she announced, settling into my living room as if she owned the place. "The HOA board has determined that allowing approved recreational activities would demonstrate your commitment to being a positive community member." I maintained my appearance of weary resignation, slumping slightly in my chair and rubbing my temples as if fighting a headache. "What kind of activities?" Her smile widened as she spread papers across my coffee table. "Hunting rights for prominent community members would be an excellent start. Several board members and major donors to our Community Improvement Fund are avid hunters who would appreciate access to your wildlife areas." The irony was so perfect it took all my self-control not to laugh. Karen was literally asking permission to walk into the trap I had been setting for months. I let the silence stretch uncomfortably long, appearing to wrestle with a decision that actually required no deliberation whatsoever. "I suppose that might help with some of the fine situations," I said slowly, as if the words were being dragged out of me against my better judgment. Karen's eyes lit up with triumph. "Exactly. Community cooperation goes a long way toward resolving compliance issues. I am sure we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Over the next hour, she outlined her vision for hunting activities on my property. A select group of HOA board members and their wealthy supporters would have access to the ranch during peak hunting season. They would focus on the pond areas where waterfowl and other game animals were most likely to congregate. The activities would demonstrate that my property could be integrated into the community's recreational interests. I agreed to everything with apparent reluctance, making sure to seem like someone who was being backed into a corner, rather than someone who was getting exactly what they wanted. Karen left that afternoon with signed permissions that she believed represented her final victory over the stubborn ranch owner who had dared to resist her authority. The hunting party was organized with military precision. Karen assembled a group that included 3 other HOA board members, 2 major donors to their legal fund, and herself as the expedition leader. They planned to arrive early on a Saturday morning in late June, during the peak of turtle breeding season, when the ancient residents of my ponds would be at their most territorial and aggressive. I spent the week leading up to their visit making careful preparations. I researched the exact legal requirements for disclosure of wildlife hazards on private property and made sure I was in complete compliance. I prepared documentation showing that hunting activities had been requested by the HOA rather than suggested by me. Most importantly, I reviewed my grandfather's journals to understand exactly what the hunters would be encountering. The night before their arrival, I walked the property boundaries one final time, making sure that all my legal obligations were met while leaving certain practical warnings deliberately vague. The hunting party would have access to the areas they had requested, but they would be responsible for their own safety and compliance with wildlife protection laws that they had never bothered to research. Saturday morning arrived with a mist rising from the ponds and the sounds of wildlife beginning their daily routines. The hunting party pulled up to my gate in a convoy of expensive trucks loaded with equipment that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. They emerged dressed in designer hunting gear that looked fresh from the catalog, complete with accessories that suggested more experience shopping for equipment than actually using it. Karen led the group like a general commanding troops, her camouflage outfit perfectly coordinated and her confidence absolute. She had traded her business suit for hunting attire, but her demeanor remained that of someone accustomed to controlling every situation through sheer force of will. I met them at the gate with minimal pleasantries and basic property orientation. I provided a simple map showing the pond locations and property boundaries, staying legally compliant with disclosure requirements, while offering no additional warnings about specific hazards they had not asked about. The pond areas you requested are marked on the map, I told them, handing over the documents they would need if questioned by authorities. All standard hunting and safety regulations apply. Karen barely glanced at the paperwork, her attention focused on the landscape beyond the gate. Perfect. We will be fine on our own from here. I watched from my kitchen window as the hunting party disappeared into the morning mist, heading directly toward the largest pond where old Moses and his companions had been ruling their aquatic domain for decades. They moved with the confidence of people who had never encountered anything they could not control through money, influence, or legal maneuvering. They had no idea they were walking into a confrontation with forces that recognized no human authority and operated by rules far older than HOA bylaws. The ancient guardians of the ponds were about to meet the modern masters of suburban control, and only one side would emerge victorious. The hunting party reached the largest pond just as the morning mist was beginning to lift, creating an almost ethereal setting that must have seemed perfect for their expedition. From my kitchen window, I could see them setting up what appeared to be a base camp on the small rise overlooking the water, their expensive equipment spread out like props in an outdoor magazine photo shoot. Karen took charge immediately, directing the placement of chairs and equipment with the same authoritative manner she used in HOA board meetings. She had positioned herself as the expedition leader, and the other members of the group deferred to her decisions about where to set up and how to approach their hunting activities. What they could not see from their elevated position was the movement beneath the water's surface. My grandfather's journals had taught me to recognize the subtle signs of turtle activity, the occasional ripples that indicated something large moving through the submerged vegetation, the displacement of water that suggested territorial patrols being conducted by the pond's ancient residents. The first sign of trouble came when one of the board members, an overweight man in his 50s named Robert, decided to get a closer look at the water to assess the hunting possibilities. The soft mud around the pond's edge had been softened by recent rains, creating unstable footing that my grandfather had always warned visitors about. Robert's expensive hunting boots found no purchase in the slick mud, and he tumbled forward into the shallow water with a splash that echoed across the quiet morning air. What should have been an embarrassing but harmless fall became something far more serious when the disturbance awakened the territorial instincts of the pond's largest resident. Old Moses emerged from the depths like a prehistoric nightmare, his massive shell breaking the surface just feet from where Robert was struggling to regain his footing. The turtle's head, easily the size of a dinner plate, rose above the water with jaws that could snap through bone as easily as breaking a pencil. Robert's surprised yelp turned into genuine terror as he realized that what he had disturbed was not some harmless pond decoration, but a living creature that viewed his presence as a direct threat to its territory. He scrambled backward through the mud, slipping and sliding, as old Moses moved toward him with surprising speed for such a massive creature. Karen's voice carried across the water as she tried to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's ability to manage. "Robert, just get out of the water. It is probably just a large fish." But it was not just old Moses. The commotion had awakened other residents of the pond, and dark shapes began moving beneath the surface throughout the area where the hunting party had established their base camp. Decades of protection under my grandfather's careful stewardship had allowed the turtle population to thrive, and the breeding season had made them extraordinarily aggressive toward anything that threatened their nesting areas. The situation escalated dramatically when Karen herself decided to wade into the water to help Robert reach safety. Her designer hunting boots provided even less traction than his had, and she immediately found herself struggling in mud that reached past her ankles. The movement attracted the attention of another large turtle that had been lurking near the fallen log where my grandfather used to sit and watch the wildlife. What followed was chaos that no amount of HOA authority could control. Multiple members of the hunting party found themselves in the water as the unstable shoreline gave way beneath their feet. The turtles, responding to what they perceived as a massive invasion of their territory during the most critical period of their breeding cycle, emerged to defend their domain with prehistoric fury. I received the first frantic phone call at 7:32 in the morning. Karen's voice was high with panic as she screamed into her cell phone about being attacked by monsters in my pond. The professional composure that had intimidated so many property owners was completely gone, replaced by raw terror, as she found herself face to face with creatures that cared nothing about her position or authority. "There are alligators in your pond," she shrieked, apparently unable to distinguish between alligator snapping turtles and their reptilian cousins. "We are trapped and they will not let us get out of the water." I calmly informed her that I was calling emergency services and advised her to remain as still as possible to avoid further agitating the wildlife. Then I contacted my friend at the state wildlife department to report that unauthorized individuals were disturbing protected turtle habitat during breeding season. The emergency responders arrived to find 6 members of Karen's hunting party stranded in and around the pond, some clinging to branches and others trapped in the mud, while massive snapping turtles patrolled the water around them. The scene looked like something from a nature documentary gone wrong, with expensive hunting equipment scattered around the shoreline and designer camouflage gear torn and muddy from the encounter with reality. The wildlife officials who arrived with the emergency responders took immediate control of the situation, documenting everything for their enforcement report. The hunting party had violated multiple regulations regarding protected wildlife habitat, and the evidence of their unauthorized activities was scattered across the pond area like an outdoor equipment explosion. As the rescue operation proceeded, I stood on my porch watching justice unfold with a satisfaction that my grandfather would have appreciated. The ancient guardians of the ponds had protected their territory exactly as they had for decades, requiring no legal briefs or court orders to enforce the natural law that had governed this land long before HOA covenants existed. Karen Blackwell, the woman who had terrorized property owners with bureaucratic authority and legal threats, sat shivering in the back of an ambulance, while wildlife officials wrote citations that would make her HOA fines look like pocket change. The aftermath of the pond incident unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated legal drama, each consequence flowing naturally from the choices Karen and her board had made over the previous months. Within hours of the rescue operation, wildlife officials had documented extensive violations of federal environmental protection laws, complete with photographic evidence and witness statements from the emergency responders. The citations carried penalties that dwarfed anything the HOA had ever imposed on property owners. Disturbing protected wildlife habitat during breeding season was a federal offense with fines starting at $10,000 per violation. With 6 members of the hunting party and multiple turtle nesting areas affected, the financial consequences quickly escalated into territory that threatened serious personal and organizational liability. Karen's humiliation was complete and very public. The local newspaper picked up the story within days, running a front-page article titled, "HOA Officials Rescued from Snapping Turtle Encounter." The accompanying photographs showed her being helped from the pond by emergency responders, her designer hunting outfit torn and muddy, her perfect hair plastered to her head with pond water. The story spread beyond the local media when regional news outlets discovered the broader context of HOA harassment that had led to the incident. Reporters interviewed neighbors who had been intimidated by the association's aggressive tactics, and the narrative quickly shifted from a simple wildlife encounter to a story about bureaucratic overreach and karmic justice. The legal consequences extended far beyond the wildlife violations. Armed with months of documentation showing the HOA's harassment campaign and unauthorized property intrusions, I filed counter-lawsuits that turned their aggressive legal strategy against them. Every violation notice they had sent became evidence of their systematic attempt to force the sale of valuable property through bureaucratic intimidation. The property values they had researched so carefully became evidence of their true motivations. The development discussions I had overheard and documented proved that their compliance demands were never about community standards, but about clearing the way for profitable real estate ventures. Karen's resignation from the HOA board came within 2 weeks of the pond incident, submitted quietly without the fanfare that had accompanied her election campaign. Her personal legal troubles were mounting as wildlife officials pursued individual penalties for each violation, and her homeowner's insurance company was questioning coverage for activities that fell outside normal policy parameters. The broader HOA community reacted with shock and growing anger as the full scope of the board's activities became public knowledge. Property owners who had quietly endured harassment and excessive fines began organizing to demand accountability and reform. The incident had exposed the association's true priorities and methods, creating a grassroots rebellion against the leadership they had trusted. My own legal position strengthened dramatically as investigators discovered the extent of the HOA's overreach. The harassment campaign that had seemed so overwhelming when I faced it alone now appeared as a clear pattern of abuse that violated multiple laws regarding property rights and fair dealing. The HOA was forced to withdraw all fines and violation notices related to my property as part of a settlement that included public acknowledgement of their improper conduct. The restrictive covenants that had threatened my ability to maintain the ranch as my grandfather intended were ruled unenforceable due to the illegal manner in which they had been imposed and enforced. Most satisfying of all was the establishment of a permanent wildlife conservation easement that protected the ponds and their inhabitants from any future development pressure. Working with state environmental officials, I created legal protections that ensured my grandfather's legacy of wildlife stewardship would continue long after I was gone. The easement designation brought official recognition of the property's ecological significance, with state biologists confirming that the turtle population represented one of the most successful conservation efforts in the region. My grandfather's decades of careful habitat management had created a thriving ecosystem that now served as a model for private land conservation. The financial impact on Karen and her associates continued to multiply as legal fees and penalties accumulated. The expensive hunting equipment they had brought to my property remained as evidence in multiple court cases, and their insurance companies were pursuing recovery actions that threatened their personal assets. 6 months after the pond incident, I stood on the same porch where my grandfather had spent countless evenings watching the sunset over his land. The ranch looked exactly as it should, with weathered barns and natural ponds that reflected the changing sky like mirrors of eternity. Karen Blackwell had learned that some forces cannot be controlled by legal threats and bureaucratic pressure. The ancient guardians of the ponds had delivered their own form of justice, teaching a lesson about respect and consequences that no HOA handbook could have provided. My grandfather's journals now sat on the shelf beside new notebooks, where I documented the continuing life of the land he had protected. The turtles went about their ancient business beneath the water's surface, eternal guardians of a place where natural law still mattered more than suburban convenience. The ranch remained in the family, protected forever by legal safeguards and prehistoric sentinels, who asked nothing more than to be left alone in the territory they had claimed long before humans arrived with their rules and regulations. Justice, as my grandfather always said, has a way of finding its own level.